How do I get slides? There we go. Cool. Hello, everyone. I hope this isn't as weird for you as it is for me, because for the last 2.5 years, I think all of us have been looking at each other through little boxes. And so I was saying to Justina a few minutes ago, it's really nice to be able to see human faces looking back at me when I say stuff. It helps me know if I'm actually slightly funny or not, because in practice, a joke doesn't really work so well when you stand there and you get a blank screen or a muted Zoom on the other side. So we'll see if I can still remember how to be funny. You can decide at the end. So the talk today is Beyond Copy Paste Agile. And I want to start with a question for you. How long does it... Ooh, I have to turn it on. See, I forgot the first thing already. You have to turn the presenter notes on. Who can tell me where this is? Does anyone know where this is? Cape Town, correct. This is Cape Town, South Africa. This is my home before I moved across the world and came this side. Basically, someone found me and said, would you like to come and hang out in the cold and darkness at this really interesting company over here? Does anyone know where this is? Stockholm, Sweden, yeah. Says one of the people that I used to work with. Thanks, Simon. So yeah, about 6 years ago, I joined Spotify and spent 4.5 years on a crazy rocket ship. When I joined, it was about 700 people, and when I left 4 and a bit years later, it was just over 5,000. I believe it's now crossing around 9,000. Crazy, crazy stories, all kinds of things that opened up really, really cool opportunity. It's a fascinating company for a bunch of reasons. But one of the things that I noticed was very often I would be out and about and people would be saying, well, we've heard of this Spotify company, we should copy that model, or we're doing something with the Spotify model. Hands up, who of you have an organization that is doing something like or related to the Spotify model? There's a couple of hands, yeah? If I can ask you to keep your hands up, but also put your hand up if you have heard of the Spotify model. Everyone? Almost everybody. Okay, cool. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story to start out with. So imagine the picture, if you will. For those of you who have kids, it might be a little bit easier to imagine the situation. But basically, the scenario is a young kid is watching their parents cooking dinner. And over the course of this cooking, the kid looks at the parents and says, why do you do that, as kids do? For those of you who have kids, you will know this is their favorite question. Why? The particular thing that was being questioned at this point in time was that the kid had noticed that the parents had cut a little bit off the top of the chicken before they put it into the pan and into the oven. The parents kind of look at each other and they go, well, actually, I don't know why we do this. I learned this from my parents. So they go and they ask the parents. They also don't know. Turns out they learned it from their parents. So a few weeks later, they're visiting the great-grandparents and they say to them, what's the deal? Why do you cut this piece off the top of the chicken? Where does it come from? The grandparents immediately pack out laughing and they say, well, my dears, when we got married, we didn't have a lot of money. Our oven was really small. Our pan was also really small. The only way to fit the chicken in the oven, in the pan, was to cut a piece off the top and the bottom. So fast forward to today, you've got this kid asking a very valid and interesting question. Why is it that we are doing this thing? 2 generations of people that have copied this idea without actually questioning why it is that this is being done. I want you to keep this in the back of your mind as we go through all of this, because I think what I see very often in organizations is this tendency to copy and borrow from others. Whether it's the Spotify model or OKRs or whatever the flavor of the minute is, we borrow things from other organizations without necessarily first stopping to think, why? Why did they do that? What is the problem they were solving, and do we have a similar problem? The other piece of this is that I think very often what we do is we forget about our perception of things, right? If you've interviewed at a company, very often what happens is you get this great story during the recruitment process, or maybe you get it in a sales pitch. Everybody describes their organization, a nice, big, shiny, brand new oven. Everything is amazing. However, once we get into the reality of things, maybe behind the scenes, we're operating with a slightly different situation, right? Equally good equipment, but perhaps works in a slightly different way. Perhaps after you've been around a couple of months, you start to realize that maybe things are a little bit more like this. And occasionally, when things get a little bit wild, maybe even a little bit like this. So the question, of course, is, well, why is the perception important? How is our perception of what our company is capable of? Why does this matter? Well, the reality is that you can cook fantastic food with any of these three, but what's possible, right, becomes different. You cannot make a pizza so easily in a microwave. I've tried. It tends to be a bit soggy and sloppy, not the best idea in the world, right? They're all capable of different things, but it's important to keep this in mind. So as we talk about this idea of moving beyond copy-paste agile, like the kid with the chicken or the family with the chicken, how do we do this? What do we want to do? I'm going to talk to you about this through three different lenses over the course of the next few minutes. The three lenses, no particular order: systems, science, and sapiens, right? Systems, kind of how all the parts fit together. We need to see the interactions, second, third order effects, these kind of things. Science, actually validating what's happening. So testing something out, having a hypothesis, seeing how it goes. And sapiens, of course, that's all of you and myself, the wonderful diversity and craziness and awesomeness that is human beings. Yeah? So let's jump into the first one. So the idea here is that we're talking about systems, or as I've called it, interactions between the flight levels. And I'll come in a minute to a bit of an explanation of what is flight levels. But maybe you've experienced this. Have you, for those of you who have been doing some kind of agile working, you have boards, but what you often find is you have this kind of chaos of being dragged from one team to another, one meeting to the next, thousands of different projects and initiatives on the go. Does this sound slightly like your reality? Yeah? Is there anyone here who's lucky enough to have one single thing that they have to do on a day-to-day basis? Not happened? It's very rare in my experience. Usually we have more ideas than we have capacity for. Part of this stems from essentially a very typical behavior that we have as human beings, is that what we're doing as managers, leaders, and individuals in the organization is that we're looking at this picture and saying, well, I think we could be more efficient with this highway. There are some gaps between those cars. And so what we should be doing is pushing extra work into the spaces, right? We do this all the time, right? So I want to tell you a little bit of a story here. Part of the challenge is that if you think about this, we have something like a board for a team, right? A typical team board, maybe sort of doing some software development work in this case. And the question that we could ask is, well, what happens when the development is done? Is this thing finished? Does it yield value for a customer? The reality is that, well, in many cases, there's another step that happens. Maybe we wait for integration. Maybe we do something like this. There's acceptance. There's a couple of other bits and pieces that have to happen, right? So what we've done is we've basically focused on seeing, but only a very small part of the flow. As we go further down, eventually what we find out is that we're doing a lot of these things on a not very agile basis, right? Maybe we integrate once a month. We release every quarter based on our customer need or based on, I don't know. There was a company I worked with the other day that still ships releases on a CD. I was like, it's 2022. What? Really? So they do it once a year because it's expensive. You have to post stuff to people, right? So we have all of these things that are happening, maybe not on a super agile basis. But of course, this only tells part of the story, because this might get us to done, but the reality is that the front end of this is only the software development backlog. And I don't know about you, but most of the organizations that I've worked with, they do more than just make software, right? The ideas tend to come from somewhere. There's maybe marketing, sales, other factors on the go. So let's ask a couple of questions. What's on the left side of this? Well, probably you see a few things like this. Maybe there's a product backlog, some analysis work. Maybe if you zoom out even a bit further, you see some sort of ideas pool, triage, some steering committees, lots and lots of people involved in this. The reality, of course, it's quite a long end-to-end flow. And what we've mostly done is focused on the software development piece. As we said already, usually these processes are not flowing as often as maybe we would like. We're shipping software in 2-week sprints or something like this, but the end-to-end flow, this is in the order of several months. Yeah? So what I want to put to you is why, if we're trying to be agile in our organizations, are we focusing only here on this piece around software development. What we tend to do is focus in on how do we make the software developers type faster, when in reality, as you can see from this picture behind me here, most of the time that is being spent, and a fair chunk of the work that's being done, but certainly a lot of the waiting that's being done, is not actually in the software development piece. At the end of the day, basically we end up in a situation, we're super fucking agile, but from a company perspective or from your customer perspective, we're still not delivering anything really very quickly. So I want to suggest to you that part of the challenge that we need to address here is that we need to visualize firstly the full end-to-end flow, all the way from vision to value, concept to cash, something like this. You'll have to excuse me for my funny taglines. I picked up a few along the way, and it's impossible to take them off my tongue or out of my brain or something like this. So what we need to do, as I said, visualize from end to end, all the way from where the idea starts, all the way to where the value is created. Yeah? The second part of this is a metaphor that maybe you have come across before. Is if we are in the business, we have many, many teams doing different things, and the customer comes to us and says, I would like you to produce something for me. In this case, we're in the business of writing letters, and the customer says, I would like a love letter. So what we do, we organize the teams around rows of the keyboard, because we have specialists for each area of the keyboard. And part of the challenge as we grow is that what we tend to do is specialize those teams even further, right? So we have optimized the A key to be pushed as fast as possible by the team that pushes the A key. But at the end of the day, the customer's request is about how good is this love letter? When can I get my love letter? It's really not about how fast each of the individual keys is pressed in this situation. It's about getting the right key to be pushed at the right time. Or to put it in a team sort of analogy, about the right team doing the right thing at the right time. Of course, this brings us to a different topic, which is primarily about feedback loops. We're talking about the interactions between the parts, right? We want our organizations to be having a healthy dose of this, I would say really for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If you don't see something like this in your cafeteria, perhaps, no, I'm joking, but basically the point is that what we want to try to do is establish the good feedback loops between the teams. So why do we want to do this? Well, if you think about this as a situation, each of these viewpoints is seeing the same actual object. We're just seeing it from a different perspective. And so what we want to try to do is start to combine these different views. What's happening at the operational level? What are we doing? What are we delivering? What are we making? What's happening in the support team? What's happening on the ground? We also, of course, need to make sense of how does this connect to the strategy of the organization, right? This is a different and unique perspective on what is happening. And, of course, there's usually some coordination that happens between. Maybe we have some project managers, maybe we have individual folks doing things. But the point is that neither of these perspectives is uniquely valuable by itself. It's only the entire set of things that brings this together. So I told you I would talk a little bit about what flight levels is. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an explanation and a picture to go with this. So in flight levels, we talk about basically thinking of an organization as 3 layers or 3 levels. And I want to make an important distinction. These are not necessarily layers in a hierarchy. The point of this is that it's levels of abstraction, right? So I've introduced you to the names already, operations, coordination, and strategy. But essentially what you think about is this operations could be teams on the ground doing anything from hiring people to building marketing campaigns to software to selling services, whatever it is. And what we need to do is bring them together to have a healthy conversation about the coordination that can deliver the strategy. So this is how I like to represent this. The idea here is essentially what we've built is something very similar to a set of Kanban boards or visual management systems. What we have is essentially something at each level that can visualize sort of one level zoomed out, right? So multiple teams need to do some work together. We build something that coordinates the end-to-end flow across those teams. Multiple products and portfolios come together to form a strategy. We visualize that at the strategic level as well. So the point I want to make mostly about this, sorry, there was an extra slide in there for some reason that was exactly the same. That's why I was staring funny at the laptop. But the point here is that we want to go beyond the team level. We cannot achieve agility in our organizations if we're only trying to optimize how fast the A key is pressed. What we have to do is we have to focus on how do we create these interactions between the different teams to create a healthy connection and produce those beautiful love letters. So to recap this topic around systems, the idea here is really two main points. We need to visualize our end-to-end flows, all the way from vision to value, concept to cash, and start to connect the strategy and the operations together, right? If you're interested to read a little bit more about either of or any of the things that I've said in these topics, or in this topic, 3 specific recommendations that I can offer that can be helpful. The first book, Donella Meadows, Thinking in Systems. If you do anything to do with systems, you should read almost everything that Donella has written at least. She's unfortunately died and so is not producing more things, because that would be weird. But yeah, she's written a lot of really, really interesting stuff. And I point out specifically one thing there. There's a blog post linked underneath the book title. It says, leverage points, places to intervene in a system. It's perhaps a little bit academic if you've just got into systems thinking, but it's really, really quite practical when you look at it. How can you think about interacting with a system? In the middle, this is my business partner, Klaus Leopold. He's written this book, Rethinking Agile, tells the story of flight levels in much more detail through the experiences that we've had working with companies around the world to help them make this stuff a little bit better and more visible within their organization. The last one is polarity management. For those of you who are struggling with the constant to and fro within an organization of shifting from let's centralize, let's decentralize, and then 2 years later, no, we need to decentralize again, this book is a fantastic way of understanding that these are often not problems to be solved, but a balance, or a polarity, as they call it, that you have to manage. Really, really insightful stuff. So, that's the sort of broad introduction around systems. Let's talk a little bit about science. Specifically, what I'm talking about in this space is around observation and experimentation. And so often what I see us doing is that we tend to come up with something and start working on it before we've really considered, why are we doing it? I'll put the lid on, because I plan to keep the laptop beyond this talk. So the question, of course, is what happens here? We get to this done stage. We saw this before. But very often what happens is that the question that we should be asking is this an outcome or an output? Because a huge part of what we're doing in our organizations, we're managing for more output, not so much for the outcome. And I want to try to shift a little bit that perspective. First, let's have a look at why does this occur? Well, I don't know if any of you have ever had something like this in your prioritization process, called the spreadsheet voodoo. Basically, what people do is they come up with a number, they multiply it by a letter, times it by an urgency in the day of the week, and then you get a magic priority order that something is supposed to be done in. Most of this is garbage. I'm sorry if you're doing it, but it mostly is not very productive. And so what we want to try to do is look maybe at some better ways of doing this. Another piece of the challenge, for those of you who know XKCD, it's a fantastic comic. We tend to make weird extrapolations, like this one. Just because you had no husbands today and you have one tomorrow does not mean you're going to have, an infinite number in the future. There is, of course, limitations, and we don't tend to take this data into account very well. If you think back to the spreadsheet voodoo, a very large amount of what we're doing in organizations is really kind of like this. We have a step 1 of our plan, we have a phase 2 that is a question mark, but somehow we are supposed to create profit at the end of the day, right? I think some of you might know the Underpants gnomes from South Park. Yeah. So why does this occur? Well, part of the challenge, I think, as Jonathan Haidt explores in this fantastic book, the human mind, we tend to think of it as if we are a logic processor. We assume that we think rationally and then arrive at a conclusion. But the reality is that what we tend to do most of the time is we make a decision intuitively, and then we use our rational and reasoning capabilities to construct a story that explains why we made the choice, right? It's a subtle difference, but it's quite important. And if we understand that this is partly how we work, we can start to become a little bit better at countering some of the downsides of this. Another fantastic way of thinking about this, as Annie Duke talks about in her wonderful book, Thinking in Bets, she talks about this concept of resulting, where what we tend to do is evaluate whether or not something was a good decision based on whether or not it had a positive outcome or not, right? So I deduce that I am good at poker because I won the hand, rather than because I was lucky or the other person just got dealt really bad cards in that situation. So what we want to do is try to become better at avoiding these kind of assumptions and these strange biases that we have. So my first tip for you in this space is to get in the habit of writing down your hypothesis, right? Before you start with something, simply just say, I assume, I guess, I want, I hope, I dream, I desire, whatever, that this will be the outcome of what I achieve in the future, right? What this allows us to do is have something that we can then reflect on in the future and say, well, what actually happened? Because the reality is that what happens that is perhaps slightly different to what we expected, this is the opportunity for learning, the gap between these two. I thought this would happen, that thing happened instead. There is some new information here that I could take into account and make a better decision in the future. If you're trying to think about how to construct these hypotheses, something that can be helpful to think about is, if we had this thing today, this feature, this team, this whatever it is, right, what would the benefit be? In current terms, right now, as a present tense, we would be making $1 million a month if we had that feature. We would be able to whatever it is. And if you can't get to a coherent explanation already, maybe you need to do a little bit more thinking or come up with a better motivation for what you're doing. Another way to think about this is to consider the idea of what assumptions would need to be true in order for this to work. Some of you, I think, were at Pavel's workshop in the morning. We were talking about sidecasting and backcasting and a number of different ways of working with complexity. These are some very practical ways of saying, well, if this thing happened, then you could see some sort of chain of events. So we can start to work on making those assumptions come true rather than just hoping that our strategies are going to work. So I've talked a little bit about this idea. Quantify your hypothesis before you start and use this as a point of reflection as you go. Maybe you're still in the habit of doing this. I'll be honest, I still do this all the time. I have 30 minutes between now and lunchtime. I can quickly send that email. When I don't finish it, now I've still got something open on the to-do list. But if you're in the habit of this, one thing that I've found super, super helpful, and especially at company scale, is to get in the habit of thinking about this metaphor of don't let number 3 block number 1. The idea is basically what we want to try to do is avoid making traffic jams or making them worse. And essentially what we're doing here, and I'll show you an example. This is an example from one of the teams that I worked with at Spotify. To be more technical, it's actually a tribe. So this is about 120 people working on this system. And on the top right-hand side, you have something called bets. The idea here is that these bets are ranked in order. So there is a number 1, a number 2, and a number 3. And if we have this approach of saying number 3 does not block number 1, or we try as much as possible to not let number 3 block number 1, we create a situation where if I say, hey, I need your help with something, we can have a conversation. I'm working on number 3, you're working on number 1. Perhaps what I should do is not interrupt you. Yeah? Or better yet, I already know you're working on it, and so I don't come and interrupt you in the first place. It helps to iron out a lot of these challenges around dependencies and issues if we can just be clear on what is actually number 1, 2, and 3. Specifically in a flight levels world, what we're trying to do is do this at multiple levels, right? So not just what's important at the team level, what's important across all of the teams within a single value stream or a single flow, and then at the company level, what's important for the company. Should we be launching in Egypt, or should we be building this partnership or acquiring that company? Which one is more important, right? If you don't do this, what happens is that all of us in the organization will make our own decision about how to treat that, and we will end up with a slightly chaotic outcome as a result. It's actually, in this case, almost better if you pick anything, but it's the same thing, than if you pick at random. So if all of us are picking the same thing, even if it was the less optimal outcome, right? It's still better because we all picked the same thing, we finished one thing, we got it done, it moved fast. So, to summarize this a little bit, what we want to try to do here is quantify our hypotheses, write them down, use them as a point of reflection so that we can learn. And secondarily, we need to get in this habit of not letting our third priority block number one. Yeah? It's about managing those trade-offs. If you want to read a little bit more about some of these topics, 3 books that I can recommend. I talked about the one on the end already, but the first 2, the wonderful Melissa Perry. The book is called Escaping the Build Trap. She talks specifically from a product and large-scale product management perspective, how you can get out of this habit of focusing on just delivering and on actually creating outcomes. All kinds of interesting ideas about product organizations and product strategy and so on. And of course, Annie Duke's Thinking in Bets. She's just published a new book, I believe. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but yeah. So that brings us to our third and final topic for today, which is about sapiens, or as the subtext says, the wonderful diversity of human beings. I wonder how many of you have heard this saying. Have you heard this? People resist change? Yeah? So maybe you've heard even the slightly more, I don't know, aggressive, problematic or something version of it, which is that people won't do the work or they won't work on those things unless we tell them what to do. The challenge for me is that I think that this is kind of born in a couple of misunderstandings about human beings' work. And essentially what I think it does is it assumes that essentially people themselves are problematic, or if you'll excuse the metaphor, dead wood, right? And I want to put it to you that is, if you have dead wood inside your company, there's only 2 ways that it got there. You either hired dead wood, or you hired live wood and then killed it. Yeah? Both of these are the responsibility of the company to address. I think a big part of this stems from a lot of our models for thinking about the world are primarily built around machines. We think about human beings when we talk about doing a restructure as we'll just take these 10 heads and move them over here. We even call people FTEs and headcounts and all kinds of words that abstract away from the wonderful, just everything that is that human being. And it ignores the fact that when I leave a team or I move to another part of the organization, I have friends, feelings, associations, emotional experiences that I've had with this group on that floor. I like that coffee machine and not this one. Anything like this. It has a huge and profound effect, and we overlook this as if we can move people around like they're pieces on a spreadsheet. A better metaphor, I think, is to think of this and our organization specifically as an ecosystem, right? It doesn't help so much if you're trying to get the plants in this forest to grow by giving them motivational targets and putting posters on the wall, shouting at them if they don't hit their quarterly KPIs. Yeah? It's not really the way that it works. What we need to do is create the right environment. You need to water just enough, or within a range. Not too much, not too little. You need to plant at the right season. You need to take care of the weeds and the invasive species. You need to take care of the bugs. Sunlight, soil conditions, all of these factors. And these things profoundly impact the quality of the wood and this type of forest that you're going to get. Can anyone tell me what's happening in this photo?
I have a guess.
Yeah?
Just a wild guess. I suspect that these are a bunch of politicians making decisions about women's rights.
Just a wild guess, says Paul. In the middle, pointing his hands like this is Mike Pence, at the time the Vice President of the United States. This is Donald Trump's Council on Women's Rights. I mean, it's shameful, but also ridiculous, regardless of what you feel about the politics. I haven't been able to find any women in the room. which to me says that there's absolutely no way that this group could ever possibly make even the remotestly good decision. It's just not going to be the case, right? How about this one? Can you tell me what's going on here? This is the ISRO, I think they're called, the Indian Space Agency. I'll be honest, the first time I saw this picture, I did not think scientists. I thought wedding, family reunion, someone graduated, something like this. Yeah. They've just successfully launched a Mars lander that landed on Mars. Well, it launched just after this. For the first time, their very, very first launch attempt, they did it for less money than Hollywood made the movie The Martian. They actually did it. They used 1/10 of the budget that anyone else has done it before or since. The team is, I think, about 70% women, which, especially in a country like India, but also in the world, is not the way that most of us tend to think of scientists. And the reason I mention this is that we have a huge amount of biases, right? The first picture, this is a selection bias, partially. There's several other issues here. Bunch of old white men having a conversation about women's rights, not going to achieve an outcome. And in this situation, we see these people and we assume something very different to their capability. So why does this happen? Well, millions of years ago, perhaps, for those of you who have studied some bits of history, most of our ancestors in some form or another were hanging out on the plains, probably similar to the area where I grew up in South Africa. Something along those lines, you're hanging out there, and all of a sudden, out the corner of the bushes, you see something yellow running at you. And you sort of go, it's moving quite fast. It's coming in my direction. I don't know, looks a little bit hungry. What do you think? What should we do? No. If you wait too long, you are lunch. Yeah? The way we learn to survive is to make fast decisions. We just react. It's better to run away from the potential lion and be wrong, maybe it wasn't a lion, than it was to forget about this lion and miss the point and become lunch. So what we learned is basically to do what we call fast fit pattern matching rather than best fit pattern matching. It's also cognitively very expensive to do deep analysis on every decision that we make. This is not something we could do about every single thing. So we make snap judgments, and we end up with a room full of white men talking about women's rights, and we look at a bunch of Indian women, and we don't think of scientists. We assume wedding, family reunion, something like this. Now, I don't tell you this to make you feel bad. It's a part of who we are and our society as a whole. There is a lot of emerging studies around all of the subtle ways that there are huge biases towards and against and for different groups in very subtle to vastly extreme ways. But what I want to encourage you to do is to invest some energy in starting to understand the ones that you do and trying to intentionally design around these biases. I want to tell you a couple of quick examples. So there is an example, I think it's from the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, about their interview process. And one of the things that they knew, or that they found, was that somebody said, hang on, why is it that the vast majority of people in the orchestra are men? Our interview pool, like the candidates in the world, is roughly split 50-50, men and women. What's going on here? So they said, well, let's run a couple of experiments. And they thought, well, maybe the obvious one was that people who are doing the interviews, they can see the person when they're doing the interview. So what they'll do is they'll put you behind a curtain and play behind a curtain. We can't see who you are, and maybe that affects something. They did this, and the results, minor shift, but nothing major, didn't really make a huge difference. Until somebody said, hang on, there was something else about this that was actually quite important. I don't know how many of you have ever been on an auditorium stage, specifically in a theater. They tend to have quite a hardwood floor, right? And if you're a woman auditioning for an orchestral role, what's the one thing that you're likely to be wearing when you arrive at your interview? High heels. Just being able to hear the heels They put a carpet down. Suddenly, 50-50 hiring. A carpet. Just hearing. It's as simple as that. This is a great example, right? Maybe not practically applicable in your work-to-work situation, but what we want to try to do, skip something there. Basically, when you're in a situation where you are like this, if you are all white men, if you are all managers, if you are all senior people, if you are all software developers, if you are all program managers, all agile coaches, invite some variety into the room. Have a different conversation by including some different people in that interaction. You will be amazed by the variety of different valuable perspectives that you are missing out in these situations. What we're trying to do, partly in this space, is create a situation where feeling or meeting a leader, for example, you don't feel like the kid on the right, or hopefully not like the guy on the left. Too often, these kind of activities tend to feel massively overwhelming. And so the other part of this is that we can't just address the diversity issue. We have to talk about creating a space where people can feel that their contribution is meaningful. So if making suggestions feels like this, perhaps running your retrospectives, maybe when you're getting restructured, feels like this. I know I've certainly felt this one. Yeah? What we have to do is bring these different perspectives together. If we're not able to see the full picture that is going on, or more of the picture, we run the risk of designing very myopic groups. We end up like Donald Trump's Council on Women's Reproductive Rights. So if you think about it like this, if diversity is being invited to the party, we need to also create an inclusive space. And inclusion in this case is being able to choose the music, or specifically choosing the music. I want to give you a couple of examples of some ways that we can overcome some of these biases. This is an example that I used. This was a sort of a leadership team check-in with the next level of leadership. And I want to talk about a couple of specific points around this, because essentially this is a fairly standard check-in in gender. We're checking in with the leadership team, so what have you achieved or learned? What are you planning to do next? What's on your minds? And specifically the last two, what we noticed was that there was a tendency for the leadership in the room to assume that if I was saying I was stressed by something, I automatically wanted your help, right? I've been very guilty of this as a manager in an organization. Somebody comes to me with something they're stressed about, and I try to jump in and help. And essentially what I'm doing there is I'm inflicting help on other people. They're not asking for it. It's unwanted. And so simply separating out this final question to say, and which of these, or what else would you need help with? And very often, the thing you need help with is something totally different, or the way you need help is, again, totally different. Another example of a very strong bias that a lot of organizations have is that we tend to prefer often either written or verbal. I've encountered both. I'm not sure what the kind of causal reasons are, but very often, specifically in a leadership and kind of strategy communication way, we'll stand up on stage and do a talk kind of like this. The challenge, of course, is that it doesn't often leave people with enough time to kind of process something. We'll wrap up with the presentation, and I'll say something like, any questions? No? Okay, cool. Let's move on to the next thing, right? We haven't actually validated what's actually happening, got a sense of how do people feel, how do they respond to this. So what I want to suggest to you is that there's a couple of things that you could consider doing in your meetings, conversations, these kind of things. Firstly, consider sharing, even if it's a slide deck, write it down, make some notes, something like this. Send something in advance so that people can read and consider it beforehand, right? Rather than trying to pitch or explain it in the conversation, share it in advance, and then have the conversation in the session that you were already planning. Another option is to give people time to think. Spend your time, present the idea, maybe you like that sort of a style, but give people more than 30 seconds to come up with their answer or their questions. In my experience, the best thinkers tend not to have the best idea on the spot in the moment, right? You will get a far deeper level of thought and analysis and understanding of something if you give people time to think and consider their response beforehand. And finally, and I'm amazed at the number of times that I have to repeat this, follow up, right? Just have a conversation with people afterwards. So we shared an idea, we did a retrospective, we did this session, we came up with a strategy, we hired these people. How is it going? What do you think about it? What did we miss? So, if you're interested in these topics, I can offer 3 books that you can read further on. First one, the wonderful Esther Derby. This book, it has one specific thing that I want to highlight. She has a model called SEAM, which for those of you who are familiar with flight levels actually maps quite closely to the flight levels. She talks about it as steering at the top, which is analogous to strategy, enabling and enhancing, which for me is a very similar part of what we mean by coordination, and making at the bottom. And she explores a number of things about, as a leader, what can you do in an agile organization? If your job used to be chasing deadlines and telling people what to do, how do you create the right clarity, conditions, and constraints to enable things to flourish? The middle one, multipliers. Liz Wiseman talks about several fantastic things. I guarantee that if you read this book, you will see a good pattern and a bad pattern of your own behavior in the models that she presents, and you'll go, oh shit, I do that. And it'll help you with some practical tools to recognize that maybe that behavior is not a bad behavior, it's just bad when you use it in the situation, and so how to match your behavior to the right situations. And Edgar Schein, this is probably one of the books that I've recommended the most specifically to white men. Ask more questions is essentially the subtext of the entire book. But he talks about practical ways that you can ask questions without sounding like you're interrogating people, to come from a place of honesty and sincerity. So, talked about a lot of things. The question that we put forward at the beginning was this: how do we move beyond copy-paste agile? In summary, we've talked about 3 topics, right? Systems, or the interactions and feedback loops across the organization, between teams, and across the flight levels. Talked about science, the shift from outcome to output, or output to outcome, sorry. Helps if I say it the right way around. Yeah? How do we quantify, reflect, and learn from the ideas and hypotheses that we put forward? And lastly, we've talked about sapiens, and specifically how to design around our intentional biases so that we can get some benefit from the diverse perspectives that we have in our organizations. This, for me, is how we create these missing links between strategy and operational agility. So, if you're a little bit tired of working in this way, you're feeling pulled from one thing to the other, I can offer you some help. We have a self-paced course. Check it out if you're curious about flight levels or any of the concepts that I've talked about. There's a discount code there as well, especially for people who are here today. Grab a photo. I will also make the slides available if you'd like to. The other thing that I can offer you is also we run a session called Flight Club roughly every 2 weeks. We live stream on YouTube. We're also getting into some pre-recorded videos and a couple of other things. If you want to join it live, jump on meetup.com to search for Flight Club. It'll be going live in Brazil and India in the next couple of weeks as well. And, of course, you can watch all the videos before. That's the wonder of the internet. In closing, I want to leave you with this. So very often I work with organizations and they tell me something like this. Their strong counter is that essentially coaching, teaching, all of this investing in our people, everything, it's really very, very expensive. Essentially for me, what this sounds like is it says, well, what if we train them and they leave? Right? And I want to put to you, what if you don't and they stay? Thank you very much. That's what I have for you today. I would love to chat further about any of these topics or other things that you find interesting. Probably the best place to find me is on LinkedIn or around a nice coffee, a beer somewhere. I will be here for tomorrow as well. But if you'd like to find me on the internet, grab me on LinkedIn and come say hi. I'd love to hear about what you're doing, what you like, what you agree with, maybe what you find a little bit tricky. It would be awesome to meet more of you. So come say hi. Thank you so much.